silent mode. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Duval, for whom Assembly Member Clark is attending as a substitute, and Assembly Member Garrett, for whom Assembly Member Boff is attending as a substitute. We also have virtual attendance from Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of December 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the summary list of actions completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted, as we had the Commissioner in front of us this morning, good morning, Commissioner, just to gently nudge you on the 20th of October meeting that you attended. You kindly agreed to send a written update on the allegations of electoral corruption in Tower Hamlets. Just to remind you, it's 100 days today to this year's local government elections. Could we have that letter from you ASAP, please?
Chair, my apologies to the Assembly Member, and yes, of course, we'll send that as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I agree with what Assembly Member Devonish has said. I represent Tower Hamlets, as you well know, and these concerns do still remain. So I'm grateful that you indicated you are looking into it.
Okay, we look forward to that, Commissioner. We now move on to our main item of business, our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And today I'd like to welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, and Cressida Dick, our Commissioner of the MPS. So, I've been asked by various members if we could have an update relating to the Downing Street parties, Commissioner. So I'm going to start off with Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Good morning, Commissioner. Commissioner, my questions are to you. Commissioner, I'm sure you can appreciate that the past few weeks have led to many Londoners feeling that it is one set of rules for the government and another for everyone else. Many constituents have rightly been angry about the perceived inaction of the police to investigate seemingly clear breaches of COVID-19 rules, and also the proximity of your officers to the rule breaking taking place at number 10 Downing Street. The perception that you're covering for those in power, however, has been building for some time. You will recall that I asked questions of Assistant Commissioner Nick Efkrel about Downing Street officers marching Sonia Khan, a junior special advisor of the premises, when ordered to do so by the government. The Treasury had to pay her off rather than face an unfair dismissal tribunal. Other instances that I raised with you included not investigating former Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick when what seemed like blatant evidence pointing to corruption was on the table, and of course Dominic Cummings' alleged COVID breaches when he was working for the government. So, Commissioner, as you're aware, official survey data shows that public trust in your force has severely waned in recent years. Do you accept, Commissioner, that these separate incidents have impacted upon this trust? Commissioner, if so, do you accept that you may need to review the way in which you and your police officers act in relation to policing the government themselves?
Well, thank you very much indeed for that question. We have known each other for a long time. We police without fear or favour. We police impartially, and we police in an operationally independent manner. I myself have, as you know, investigated more politically charged investigations and investigations involving members of the government, members of the civil service, and other elected officials, many more than any other senior police officer, I would suggest. And I've always done that and will always do that, as I say, impartially. I absolutely understand that there is deep public concern about the allegations that have been in the media over the last several weeks. I completely understand that. The vast majority of people have acted responsibly during the pandemic. Many, many people, including many Londoners and indeed my colleagues, have made huge sacrifices and they've suffered considerable loss during the pandemic. And As you know, also throughout the pandemic, my officers and my staff have kept going. They've put themselves in harm's way to tackle crime, to tackle violence, and to do their bit to help our city in the health crisis. Chair, if I may, I would like to just quickly explain our general approach before turning very specifically to the matters relating to Downing Street. We have, throughout the pandemic, adopted, as you know, the approach of the 4 E's, invented in London and adopted nationally. We engaged with people at the time, we explained the restrictions, we encouraged people to adhere to them, and as a last resort, but only as a last resort, we moved to enforcement. In general, we have not normally investigated breaches of the regulations when they have been reported long after they have said to have been taken place. And I'll like, if I may here, just quickly to explain why. It was never a blanket rule, but it was our guidelines that in general we wouldn't. And we've said that publicly on many occasions. Throughout the pandemic, our focus has been on what we could do to benefit public health. We police by consent, and people need to see that what we're doing has a purpose. Hence the 4 E's approach. And of course, we did issue tickets, and we did enforce with some really flagrant breaches, but most people, as you all well know, responded very well to our engagement and changed their behaviour. We do have finite resources, and even more so during the worst periods of the pandemic, when our officers fell ill, as well as other people. And our view was and is that it would not normally be a proportionate use of officers' time to spend their time bearing in mind the nature of the offences after the fact, investigating what could have been thousands of complaints. These are summary-only offences. The people who commit them get a fixed penalty notice. I think in general, the public would understand that we need to focus on violent crime and terrorism and other priorities, as well, of course, as doing our bit during the pandemic. But recognising that there might be some occasions where we would investigate retrospectively, we generated some guidelines, only guidelines, but guidelines that we have stuck to. And you will be aware that we have, on occasion, investigated retrospectively. Some of my own officers, a few, have received penalty notices when we heard after the fact that they had breached the guidelines. 1 or 2 high-profile people also, when it was plain that they had admitted and there was good evidence, they also, after the fact and a few weeks after the fact, received penalty notices. And the occasions on which we have done that have been where we were looking at something which appeared to be the most serious and flagrant type of breach, and where 3 factors came into play. Firstly, there had to be, of course, I'll add a 4th, there has to be some kind of evidence, not just somebody saying something. There has to be some sort of start point, some sort of evidence. But my 3 factors were and are, there was evidence that those involved knew or ought to have known that what they were doing was an offence. Where not investigating would significantly undermine the legitimacy of the law, and where there was little ambiguity around the absence of any reasonable defence. So in those cases where those criteria were met, the guidelines suggested that we should potentially investigate further and end up giving people tickets. We have a long-established and effective working relationship with the Cabinet Office, who have an investigative capability. And as you well know, they have been carrying out an investigation over the last few weeks. And what I can tell you this morning is that as a result, firstly, of the information provided by the Cabinet Office inquiry team, and secondly, my officer's own assessment, I can confirm that the Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years in relation to potential breaches of COVID-19 regulations. My officers have assessed several other events that appear to have taken place at Downing Street and Whitehall. On the available information, these other events are assessed as not reaching the threshold for criminal investigation. Throughout the pandemic, the Met has sought to take, as I have said, a proportionate approach. I should stress that the fact that we are now investigating does not, of course, mean that fixed penalty notices will necessarily be issued in every instance and to every person involved. We will not be giving a running commentary on our current investigations, but I can assure you that we will give updates at significant points, as we would generally do. And finally, I would just say, you mentioned a number of other matters that you are clearly frustrated about, and no doubt some other people as well. I know what you are talking about in each instance. I suspect it's not worth discussing them here and not appropriate. All I would say is I beg to differ. I am fully aware of the decisions that were made in each of the cases that you mentioned, Umesh, and I believe we did the right thing, and we will always seek to do the right thing.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Assembly Member Russell, if you've got anything different, but a question, not a statement, please.
Chair, I have very clear questions that relate to what.
Well,
the
don't forget, we're only allowing 15 minutes for this.
I am aware, and I've got the clock running. Commissioner, you've just set out what was part of what was said in the 13th of January statement by the Met, that you don't routinely investigate retrospective breaches of COVID laws, and that you used a 4Es approach, which is to engage, explain, encourage, enforce at the time of breaches, and that you may review and consider significant evidence if it becomes available. Was there any attempt made to use the 4Es approach to engage, explain, encourage, enforce with attendees at any of the Downing Street lockdown parties while they were happening?
So I think you will understand that it's inappropriate for me to comment on that. We are in the middle of an investigation, and when we have investigated, then I'm sure the facts will become apparent. You shouldn't read anything into that apart from the fact that I'm not prepared to comment.
Thank you. It sounds like there was a culture of law-breaking parties rather than a single one-off event. We've heard reports of wheelie suitcases of drink clanking through security. Surely some officers were concerned about what they were seeing at the time. Was any concern raised with you or any member of your team about what was going on in Downing Street while the coronavirus lockdown laws were in place?
So you'll be aware that there are a number of officers posted in the surrounds of Downing Street and indeed what we call more generally the government security zone. They have a very clear role, and that is protective security. You'll be aware that the ones you see are all armed, and they have a job to do. In relation to anything they may have seen or heard or done or not done, again, I'm afraid I'm not prepared to comment, but I can assure you that we are carrying out our investigations, and if that is a relevant matter, we will find out about that.
Thank you. The problem is that if people begin to think that the laws apply to everyone except the people who set those laws, then the police may struggle to retain that public consent that enables them to do their jobs. Are you worried that the apparent lack of investigation of the mess in Downing Street might be further damaging trust and confidence in the police?
So I fully recognise people have been very concerned about this. I think you will recognise also that in the explanation, I hope, in the explanation I've given, you can see that we have acted carefully, thoughtfully, and in concert with the Cabinet Office inquiry. I do need to say we work very regularly with the Cabinet Office team. Even sometimes in the most serious cases, they will carry out an initial investigation and then hand us material. And they have access to all sorts of things because they know the systems, they know the way things work. And I am confident in the inquiry that they have done. I don't like anything that can potentially damage public confidence. Of course I don't. But I have to do what I think is the right thing in all the circumstances. And sadly, in policing, also recognise that sometimes some people won't be happy. But as long as we know that we have acted fairly, impartially, that we have done our jobs and we've done them to the best of our ability, then that's what we have to do.
And just finally, your investigation, the welcome investigation that the Met is now investigating a number of events, when do you expect to be able to report back on that?
So I can't give you a timescale, I'm afraid, at the moment. I just can't. All I can say is we won't give a running commentary, but in accordance with our normal press guidelines, we will, of course, update the public at significant moments.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, I don't imagine any of the parties were silent discos. We've seen pictures of people gathering in the garden over wine and cheese. As already mentioned, police on site probably would have heard drinking and talking in the garden, but also Downing Street in the area has so many CCTV cameras 24 hours a day. Will those form part of your investigation that you've announced this morning?
We will, of course, be going where the evidence takes us, and we have already done our own assessment, as you know, and we've been in a constant dialogue with the Cabinet Office team, so I don't anticipate any difficulty in obtaining the evidence that it is both necessary, proportionate and appropriate for us to obtain in order to get to the right conclusions.
Lovely, thank you. And could you just finally clarify, you talked about some parties that you're going to be investigating. Does this also include the alleged party at CCHQ, which we saw a photograph of?
So I'm not going to talk about, there's been a whole plethora of things in the media, as everybody is very well aware. I'm not at this stage going to say which ones we are and which ones we are not. But I can say, as I have, that we are investigating a number, and there are several that we are not investigating.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to go on to the very serious issue of the Stephen Port murders, and I think, colleagues, we should reflect upon the point that 4 young men lost their lives, and so serious questions do need to be addressed. So if I can start with you, Commissioner, what is your response to the findings of the inquest into the Stephen Port murders?
Well, firstly, Chair, if I can join you in saying how terribly sad it is that these 4 young men lost their lives, Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel and Jack. And I know that they are sorely missed by their families and many, many other people. The jury found that the deaths of the 3, as opposed to Anthony, could have probably been prevented, and we accept that finding. And that is, I think Helen Ball said at the time, a devastating finding. It is a matter of deep, deep regret, and I have also apologised publicly, and indeed have been able to meet the families of 3 of the young men who were killed, and am about to meet the 4th family also. I have further apologised to them from the bottom of my heart. It is a matter of deep regret that we did not do a better job in those investigations. What I can say, and I'm sure you want to question me about this, is that since Stephen Port was brought to justice, we've made a large number of changes in the Met as a result of beginning to understand what had gone wrong. We have, of course, followed the inquest very carefully and have made further changes as a result of what we heard at the inquest. We are in possession of an independent Office of Police Conduct report, which suggests further lessons for us, most of which we have very well in hand, but we're working closely with them. And we will, of course, be responding appropriately to the coroner's prevention of further deaths report, which has, I think, been, which is finished, but is not yet in the public domain. So we've made an enormous number of changes, and I'm very happy to speak about those. And we will continue to work to make sure that we have really high quality investigations in all cases, of course, but in particular here in the cases where someone has died, and that we work very, very effectively with all our public, but not least, of course, the LGBTQ+ communities, to try to ensure that we are fully culturally competent, and that we engage and communicate and listen and understand effectively, and that we continue to learn, so that we will build further trust and confidence, and particularly, as I say, in our LGBTQ+ communities.
Yes, I agree. Sophie, do you have anything to add to that?
I would add my also heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims, and of course, followed the court case very carefully, as well as followed the inquest very carefully. And as the Commissioner said, it is a really devastating finding of the coroner that the 3 young men's lives probably could have been saved, and that's something that clearly the families will have to live with all their lives, and we will also have to live with. One of the things that we, from MOPAC and my role as oversight and holding the Met accountable, have done following the inquests, I've written to HMIC and on behalf of myself and the Commissioner to ask them to come in and do an inspection into the way that the Met investigate. We are at the moment discussing those terms of reference with HMIC, and of course we'll be looking at the Prevention of Deaths report from the coroner to make sure that those the terms of reference are appropriate and pick up everything it needs to pick up. That's a really important investigation from HMIC. I hope they'll be able to start their inspection, in spring. And also, of course, the Commissioner has set up the review by Baroness Louise Casey that's looking at the culture in the Met. Clearly, there still are questions around homophobia and discrimination, and I hope that the review that is just getting underway by Baroness Louise Casey will be able to look at that, and we'll be looking at the culture of the Met, including whether there is homophobia.
Yes, we're picking up on that a bit later. Commissioner, you said you've made some changes. I mean, you've obviously, the inquest raised that the Met missed several opportunities to prevent the deaths of Port's victims. So what action have you taken already before any of these examinations come to part? What action have you taken already before you wait for anything to come through?
Thank you, Chair. Well, if I talk about sort of running into the inquest as a sort of first time period where we were making changes, so between the time of the murder conviction and the inquest, We created in 2016 a new policy on how we investigate unexplained, as it was then called, or non-suspicious deaths. And that produced a step-by-step guide for investigating officers, and that has been amended a couple of times since. We rapidly improved our knowledge of the way in which GHB and similar can be used as a weapon. We launched awareness training for officers, and we've shared that knowledge with policing nationally. More generally, we have been very active in work on chemsex more broadly, making sure that our officers have a good understanding of that. We now ask for a test for GHB in all cases of sexual assault where there's even a possible idea that a drug might have been used as a weapon, and in all unexplained or suspicious deaths, whatever the circumstances, we quickly examine for that. We have improved substantially the way we train our investigators from recruit stage right through to senior investigating officers, and many of the courses, including the senior investigating officers, include an input very specifically on what happened in these tragic matters and what Stephen Port did and what we didn't do. That'll be updated in the coming weeks. Very profoundly, we have changed our leadership structures and lines to ensure that our homicide teams and our local teams are geographically aligned and work much more closely together. What you see on a daily basis, because sadly people do die in London on a daily basis, is a much more active and disciplined co-working between the homicide teams, who will be called in for advice in the first instance if it is not seen absolutely, obviously as a suspicious death, and the local teams. And there is much better communication at all stages to ensure that where it is appropriate for the homicide team to take precedence, that they will. I think we saw some significant failures in supervision and in leadership. And so I would say there were some system failures and some individual failings, no doubt. And what they sort of combined to create was this terrible set of circumstances. So under my leadership, we've been focusing enormously on improving supervision and leadership. We've had a big program of sort of leadership improvement. We also, during that time period, have been working much more closely with our LGBT+ communities. And if I perhaps focus on that for a second and bring that up to date, you will be aware that we now have our large cohort of LGBT+ advisors locally. These are all volunteers, very enthusiastic, very positive. And for example, on the East area, there would be 6 of those. And they are available to officers at all times, and they will put themselves into matters that they hear about to say, is there any assistance I can give you? We've been working very closely with the LGBT+ forums and with our advisory group, and they have been helping us very substantially, both in the way in which we engage with our communities, but also in terms of the training of our officers. So training on LGBTQ+ issues from recruit stage onwards has changed hugely since 2013-14. As an example, our LGBT+ network in the Met, who many of you will know some of them, again, very energetic colleagues. They attend every single recruit training event, course, and provide an input to them, not just about, far from it, not just about being, gay in the Met, but also about how to work most effectively with communities. During the inquest, there were some very specific things, I think, that came to our notice, which we would anticipate that the coroner will comment on, and we've been working on that very hard over the last few weeks. And I hope that we will be completing our initial 10 actions on those by the end of February. So we have changed some of our training on the role and expectation of sergeants and inspectors at special post-mortems. We have hugely increased the awareness of the role of the review group and when you should call them in and what they can do to help. I should say that our kind of organisational learning ability has improved a lot since then. I'm going to finish in a second, Chair, I promise you. We have amended some of our policies as a result of the inquest. There were some very clumsy, I think, phrases in some of our policies. For example, being very clear with people that the word family for family liaison officer includes partners, parents, siblings, children's guardians, and others who may not be related but who have a direct and close relationship with with the victim, clearing up some of the misunderstandings there seem to have been about next of kin. So some quite detailed but very important changes in our policy and our practice. We have, as you know, a huge technology set of changes coming in later in the year, and we will be completely changing our information platform to take on something called Connect. And it might sound a bit arcane, but it will make the job of the supervisor very much easier in terms of making sure that investigative actions which should have been done but don't appear to have been done or end up not being done can be spotted very quickly by the supervisor, and the requirement for sign-off is much sort of stronger. Okay. So that will deal perhaps with some of those questions that we had about follow-through. And then the last thing is just constantly explaining to people the need to be both clear about roles and who is doing what. We do very complex work, which is about teams, and it's about teams of teams all the time. And sometimes things do go wrong between individuals or between teams where someone thinks somebody's done something and somebody else hasn't. Yeah. And that has to be checked. And so we're working very hard on the sort of underlying culture. I'm very proud, as you know, of the vast majority of my people, and I'm very proud of we are a proud police service. We're a world-leading police service in terms of investigations, and so many people would say that in the modern age. This was not good, and we need to make sure we improve.
I think we all recognise that, but it was one thing after another that went wrong with this case. It really was, and the thing that concerns me is it doesn't matter what you put in place if the people following things up don't look a little bit further. I mean, the fact that those murders were not linked with each other, the fact that it was the sisters, really, of Jack that did the investigative work, and they are not investigators, is quite shocking. And had they not done that, one has to ask the question, who would have been next, which is alarming to all of us. You've answered, in effect, a lot of my next questions, but there's a couple of things that I need to ask you. Sure. If we talk about the drugs, you now know about that specific drug. Mm-hmm. Are you always updating information? Because there must be new drugs that come on. Unfortunately, I do not know anything about drugs, so I'm a bit hopeless, clueless, some would say. But, are they being updated to the Met the whole time so that toxicology can check that?
They absolutely are, Chair, and that's very important, and our head of forensics takes that really seriously, and we're very involved with a lot of national groups and working with the scientists and the coroners on that. Two things I should very quickly mention that you've triggered with your question, if you don't mind. One is we have invested much more in our analytic capability and our ability very specifically to link both sexual offences and indeed deaths. So we have more and more capable people working on that, which will undoubtedly help with what can sometimes, I'm not talking about this particular set of circumstances, but can sometimes be, a really, tricky exercise to see that something is actually potentially or actually actually linked. And we had an example just last week of a very good case of linking a series of horrible offences actually against gay men, which was done by really good analysis. And the second thing to say is we now have, and it might sound a bit dull, but we have our head of profession for investigations who's at commander level and whose whole job is to improve the overall capability across the Met and make sure that whenever we get recommendations that we accept, that we get them properly implemented and we kind of look to the future. So we've got much more leadership around these issues now.
Okay, because it's not just capability, it's care as well. And it's the
agree.
care aspect of this that certainly struck me, that had somebody, I'm not going to name any of the names of the office, but if they'd taken a little bit more care and looked at the videos and done all that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to particularly bring out, you've mentioned the family liaison officers. Do we still have brand new officers that are family liaison officers? Because they're dealing with people at their most vulnerable time. They're utterly devastated at what's happened, with whoever or whatever their, the reason for them having lost somebody. Is it sensible to be putting brand new officers in that position? Because it does take a certain person that can cope with that, I would suggest.
Absolutely. Inevitably, it's in the nature of policing that it's perfectly possible that the first officer who speaks to a family may very well be a relatively new officer. You can imagine the circumstances where perhaps somebody turns up at a cordon and it's a probationer who's standing at the cordon. But when you're talking about trained family liaison officers, yes, I can say to you that they are all, with the exception of 2 departments, detectives. Now, they have to be detectives, and you can't be a detective without having had the full kind of training program. So you wouldn't get a highly inexperienced or early in-service person doing the family liaison role. The only 2 areas of the Met where at the moment we don't always have fully trained detectives, but they are fully trained family liaison officers and very experienced, is in our, I believe, Road Traffic Command and in aviation policing. But those are very experienced officers who are then taking on that role. The course that they do is now stronger and longer than it was, and we have a much stronger central capability in our central family liaison team, who are very active in going out and making sure that people are competent and keeping up with their continuous professional development. There's far more available to the officers in terms of continuous professional development as well now.
Good. I'm pleased to hear that, and I think especially Anthony's family were particularly treated badly. Sophie, if I can just ask you, following the findings of the inquest, what role can MOPAC play to improve trust and confidence in the LGBT plus community? Because it really has been damaged badly by this, quite rightfully.
Thank you, and sorry, apologies, I can't make my mic turn off and I'm not speaking. So we've clearly, MOPAC has a role, as we all know, around accountability and oversight of the Metropolitan Police, and also in relation to setting the priorities. You'll have seen from the draft Police and Crime Plan that trust and confidence is one of the key priorities. And what we will do, working with the Metropolitan Police to improve trust and confidence, is we're really looking at what those drivers are of trust and confidence. And one of the key drivers is effectiveness. So all the things that the Commissioner has set out about how they have put in improvements since 2016, improvements to investigation, improvements to family liaison officers, to analytics, to forensics, should help improve trust and confidence, because it should help improve the investigations and improve the outcomes of the investigations. But of course, I hope that the HMIC inspection that we've commissioned will also help along that journey of improving trust and confidence of the LGBT plus Q plus community, because they really do need to see, as do the families, that not only has the Met put in place these changes, but they have had the impact that they should have had and that they expected to have. The other issue around trust and confidence is in terms of engagement. The STRIDE strategy, the Commissioner's STRIDE strategy, is very clear about focusing on disability and on LGBTQ plus communities to improve their trust and confidence, to improve the detections, especially in hate crime, but also to improve the relationship and the engagement. We will have oversight of how those advisors at BCU level are working, what impact they're having, and we will also continue to liaise with communities to make sure that what we hope is going to have an impact is having the impact that it should have. And we will track that through the public attitude survey, where we can very clearly break down the data into the protected characteristics. And we're also, as you know, boosting the public attitude survey. So we will be able to see where there are local issues, and particularly local issues around trust and confidence.
Okay, because obviously we're all concerned about the trust and confidence figures. They're going in the wrong direction. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I intend to ask my questions in two sort of sections, and I'll explain why in a minute. But firstly, Chair, can I say this, that through you, can we send our thoughts to the families of Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel, and Jack? I know that the families, or some of them certainly, the Taylor sisters, are actually watching these proceedings as I speak. And can I also assure them, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of the whole committee, that we will do everything we can from this committee, from this institution, to help you in your campaign and to achieve fundamental reforms, the reforms that I know that you desperately seek. Chair, the family has been in touch with you, or the family of the Taylors did send you some questions to ask on your behalf, and they also sent me the same set of questions, Commissioner, Deputy Mayor. I won't go through all the questions which I received this morning from the Taylor sisters, the questions were signed off by the two sisters, signing themselves off as the broken sisters of Jack Taylor. One can only imagine their grief, ongoing grief. As I say, I won't answer all the questions. I won't set out all the questions because some of them have already been answered. But there are a couple of questions that I do think I need to put to you, Commissioner and Deputy Mayor. That firstly, if you just bear with me, all different police officers, regardless of rank, did not fulfill any part of their duty as a police officer. Do they not think that this shows an underlying issue such as homophobia? Now, I know, Deputy Mayor, you referred to the issue of homophobia that will be looked at. But, Commissioner, I want to ask you this specifically. Do you think that homophobia played a role in hampering the investigation, the complete and total mishandling of the situation right from the beginning? And I'll tell you why I ask you this. Because Assistant Commissioner Helen Ball said at the end of the inquest, quote, "We don't see institutional homophobia. We don't see homophobia on the part of officers." To be fair to her, she does that say, "We do see all sorts of errors in the investigation which came together in a truly dreadful way." Now, what concerns me is this rush to dismiss the issue of institutional homophobia? Because you did the same thing about Daniel Morgan, that dismissing, this was your deputy, Stephen House, that dismissing the concept of institutional corruption in the man. Wouldn't a better response be to say, hey, look, we think that that's not the case, but we'll take a step back. We'll look at the findings of the inquest. We'll examine things in the cold light of day. And then we'll come to a considered decision whether there is institutional corruption in the MAT. I know it's a different topic, but I've got to make reference to what happened a few months ago when your office was before this committee. We will consider whether institutional homophobia did play a role. Why the haste to dismiss something so quickly? And as I said, that's a specific question that I'm putting to you on behalf of the Taylor sisters.
Apologies. I don't think we've been hasty to dismiss. I mean, again, just to say that I've spent my life as a police officer trying to bring justice and caring deeply about equalities, and caring deeply about providing as good a service as we can to all our incredibly diverse communities. And like Helen, I accept that there were errors. And as I've said, some of this was about systems, and some of this was about individuals, and some of this was about leadership and supervision. But I would refer you to the coroner's direction to the jury, that during that very, 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 very extensive inquest, all manner of evidence, and I suspect everything that could have been looked at, was looked at. Was put in front of the coroner, and I'm not going to remember her exact words, but she directed the jury that because of the lack of evidence around homophobia, in essence, they could not find that as part of the reasons. And so I do not rely on, but to some extent defer to the coroner. This has been examined in very great detail. We're not hasty to dismiss, and nor, Chair, I think, am I naive. But we don't actually, when we look at what happened here, see what, and it's obviously a contested concept anyway with multiple definitions, but we don't see institutional homophobia, and we don't see institutional homophobia in the modern Met. But I absolutely accept that it's possible that in many different places, I have instances or people who are not, culturally competent or aware in a particular way. It's possible that people stereotype, that people are, allow bias to take part, and that includes in relation to LGBTQ plus people. Absolutely. I'm not dismissing the whole idea that we don't have more to do to be absolutely sure that we've got rid of anybody who actually is actively homophobic. We don't need them, and that the rest of our colleagues are capable. Sure. And that's one of the things, as the Deputy Mayor said, that Louise Casey will be looking at. Okay. She will be having a look at the issues about how we relate to people from the LGBTQ plus communities, internally and externally. And I'm looking forward to seeing what she sees. I'm pretty hopeful that she will say,
Commissioner,
in the matter of the last 10 or 15 years, things are transformed in all sorts of ways. I'd be surprised if she doesn't find some things we can do now to improve even further.
Commissioner, I do have 2 or 3 questions. I know that my other colleagues have also questions, but I'm here today as an advocate for Londoners, not just my constituents, but for Londoners around policing issues. And I've got to tell you what the family said, that we as a family do believe it's down to the officers being homophobic and prejudiced, and that is why they fail the boys. But I won't push this point any further. You said what you had to say. So can I also ask you that, again, this is a question from the family, does the police think that it's acceptable that not only did the Taylor sisters do the police investigation, they are now having to fight and push for a public inquiry? What are your thoughts about a public inquiry? And this question is to both of you.
So,
and this is a call made by Margaret Hodge MP and many other MPs, yes. London MPs.
You've mentioned Jack's sisters twice, and just for the record, my heart does absolutely go out to them. And as the chair said, they ended up doing, in the most awful situation, and doing an enormous amount of investigation and shoving and campaigning, and they still campaign. And I take my hat off to them. It would be completely inappropriate for me to say there should or should not be a public inquiry. That's a matter for the Home Secretary. What I have said is that if that public inquiry is designed to look at institutional homophobia, then my start point is I don't see that in the Met. But they are absolutely entitled to their opinion, and my heart goes out to them.
So a final question on behalf of the families, because they are at the center of things. So I make no apologies for putting these questions to you. They ask, do the police not feel that everyone should be treated the same, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, religion, and ethnicity? If the answer to this is yes, do they not realize this is not what they portray to the public? Time and time again, we see the police have failed the communities that they are there to protect. Is the Commissioner going to take responsibility for